December 9th, 1945. If General George Smith Patton had lived just one more week, the course of post-war Europe would have been completely different. Not slightly altered, not marginally changed, completely different. The man they called Old Blood and Guts, a nickname earned through decades of leading from the front, charging into battle while other generals commanded from the safety of rear headquarters, lay dying in a hospital bed. But this wasn't supposed to happen. Not to him. Not like this. 24 hours earlier, George Smith Patton had been the most powerful American general in Europe, commander of the Third Army, conqueror of Nazi Germany, the man who'd punched through enemy lines faster than any military force in human history. 10 months earlier, he'd led his troops across the Rhine River, crushing everything in their path. 6 months before that, he'd relieved Bastogne in just 72 hours when every other general said it was impossible. They called him Old Blood and Guts because he embodied war itself. Fearless, aggressive, unstoppable. He wore pearl-handled pistols on his hips. He cursed like a demon. He believed in reincarnation and claimed he'd fought in every major war throughout history. His soldiers loved him. His enemies feared him. His superiors couldn't control him. But on December 9th, 1945, General George Smith Patton couldn't move. A car accident. A simple, stupid car accident on a hunting trip near Mannheim, Germany. His neck was broken. His body was paralyzed from the neck down. The greatest combat general in United States military history was dying not from enemy fire, not from heroic sacrifice, but from a traffic collision. This is what happened next. December 10th, 1945. The hospital room at the 7th Army Hospital in Heidelberg was quiet except for the labored breathing of Old Blood and Guts himself. Doctors moved around him with grim faces. They knew. Everyone knew. This was a man who'd survived 2 world wars, who'd been shot at by German machine guns, who'd commanded tanks under artillery fire, who'd walked through minefields, and now he was dying from a broken neck sustained when his Cadillac sedan collided with an army truck. General George Smith Patton knew it too. He wasn't stupid. He'd seen enough dying men to recognize the signs in himself. But what tormented him wasn't death itself. He'd never feared death. It was how he was dying. "This is a hell of a way to die," he told his wife Beatrice on the second day after the accident. She sat beside him, holding his hand, one of the few parts of his body he could still feel. 45 years they'd been together. She'd followed him through 2 world wars, through controversies and triumphs, through glory and disgrace. Now she was watching him die. But George Smith Patton wasn't finished talking. His mind was still sharp. His voice, though weakened, still carried that commanding tone that had rallied armies. "The last great opportunity of a lifetime," he said, his eyes staring at the ceiling. "And I'm too old or too slow to take advantage of it." What opportunity? The nurses didn't understand. The doctors looked confused. But Beatrice knew. Old Blood and Guts was talking about the Soviets. For months, General George Smith Patton had been warning anyone who would listen. The war wasn't over. Not really. The United States and Britain had defeated Nazi Germany, yes, but they had helped create an even bigger monster. The Soviet Union. Joseph Stalin's Red Army now occupied half of Europe. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, East Germany, all under Soviet control. George Smith Patton had seen it coming. In May of 1945, just days after Germany surrendered, he'd told his staff officers, "We've defeated the wrong enemy." He wanted to keep going, keep his Third Army rolling east, push. The Soviets back across their borders, while the United States still had the military might to do it. Strike now, before Stalin consolidated his grip on Eastern Europe. "We should have gone to Moscow," Patton had said in July. "We could have done it easily." But Washington said no. President Harry Truman said no. General Dwight Eisenhower said no. The politicians wanted peace. The American people wanted their soldiers home. Nobody had the stomach for another war, especially against an ally. So George Smith Patton had waited, commanding occupation forces in Bavaria, watching the Soviet threat grow, knowing that history would prove him right. And then came December 8th, 1945, and that damn car accident. Now Old Blood and Guts lay paralyzed, helpless, watching his last chance slip away. I can't even get out of bed to fight, he said bitterly. The challenge facing General George Smith Patton wasn't military anymore. It was existential. How does a warrior die? How does a man who'd built his entire identity around combat, around leading men into battle, around victory through aggression, how does such a man face death in a hospital bed? But could old blood and guts find peace in these final days? Could a man who'd lived by the sword accept dying in a bed? The next 72 hours would tell. December 11th, 1945. George Smith Patton's condition was deteriorating. The paralysis remained complete. Respiratory problems were developing. Pneumonia was setting in, the killer of paralysis patients. But old blood and guts remained conscious, and his mind remained active. Visitors came in a steady stream. Officers from the Third Army, fellow generals, old friends. They came to pay their respects to the dying legend, but they also came because they couldn't believe it was happening. This was Patton. He'd survived everything. Surely he'd survive this too. General Jeffrey Keyes, his deputy commander, visited on the 11th. He tried to keep the conversation light, talking about hunting, about post-war plans, about anything except the obvious. But George Smith Patton cut through the pleasantries. "This is it, Jerry," he said. "This is a hell of a way to die." There was that phrase again. It would become his most quoted statement, his epitaph, the summary of his entire philosophy of life and death. A hell of a way to die, not in glory, not in battle, not leading a charge, but immobilized, helpless, defeated by random chance. "I should have died in combat," Patton continued. "That's how a soldier should go, leading his men, taking fire, going forward." He'd come close so many times. In World War I, at the Battle of Meuse-Argonne in September of 1918, then Colonel George Smith Patton had been shot through the leg while personally leading tanks into combat. He'd refused evacuation, continuing to direct his forces until blood loss forced him to collapse. He'd survived. In World War II, during the invasion of Sicily in July of 1943, German bombers had attacked his headquarters. Bombs exploded around him. Everyone dove for cover, except old blood and guts. He'd stood in the open, firing a pistol at the aircraft overhead, cursing them. Not a scratch. In France, in July of 1944, he'd driven to the front lines daily, often under artillery fire, sometimes under direct enemy observation. His staff begged him to stay back. He'd refused. "I want them to see me," he'd said. "I want my men to know I'm here." He'd survived. At the Battle of the Bulge in December of 1944, exactly 1 year before this hospital room, General George Smith Patton had been in the thick of the fighting. His Third Army had executed the most remarkable military maneuver of the war, pivoting 90 degrees north and smashing into the German flank. Old blood and guts had been everywhere, rallying troops, directing attacks, exposing himself to enemy fire. Not a wound. He'd survived it all. And now this. A car accident, a broken neck, paralysis, death in a hospital bed. "The proper way for a soldier to die is by the last bullet in the last battle," Patton said to another visitor on December 12th. But there was something else eating at him, something beyond his own death. The war he couldn't fight, the enemy he couldn't engage, the Soviets. George Smith Patton had been studying the Soviet threat since May. He'd met with intelligence officers. He'd interrogated captured German generals who'd fought on the Eastern Front. He'd positioned his Third Army along the border with Soviet-occupied territory, ready to strike if ordered. "We're going to have to fight them eventually," he'd told his staff in June. "Why not do it now while our army is intact and we're already here?" The German officers agreed with him. One captured Wehrmacht general had said in August, "General Patton understands. He sees what's coming. Your other generals are blind." Even some of the German soldiers who'd fought against the Third Army respected old blood and guts. They called him Der blutige General, the bloody general. They feared him, yes, but they also recognized his genius. A captured German tank commander had said, "We knew when we were facing Patton. His attacks were different, faster, more aggressive. He fought like we did in the beginning in 1940. This is why they called him Old Blood and Guts. Not just because he was tough, but because he understood war at a fundamental level. He saw it clearly, without sentimentality, without hesitation. War was about killing the enemy before they killed you. It was about speed, aggression, and will. Political considerations were for politicians. Military objectives were for soldiers. And right now, George Smith Patton could see the military objective clearly. The Soviet Union was the next threat. The United States needed to act, but nobody was listening. "We've defeated the wrong enemy," he'd said again in September. The quote had been leaked to reporters. It had caused an uproar. Politicians in Washington were furious. The press called him reckless, dangerous, a warmonger. General Eisenhower had relieved him of command of the Third Army, reassigning him to a paper-shuffling job overseeing military records. Old blood and guts had been humiliated, sidelined, silenced, and now he was dying. On December 13th, his condition worsened. The pneumonia was spreading. Breathing became more difficult. Blood clots were forming, another deadly complication of paralysis. The doctors knew he had days at most, but George Smith Patton remained mentally alert. Between labored breaths, he continued talking, sometimes about the past, sometimes about the future he wouldn't see, always returning to the same themes: duty, courage, leadership, and the conviction that he was right about the Soviets. "They'll see," he whispered to Beatrice. "In 10 years, they'll wish they'd listened to me." He was right. By 1955, the Cold War would be in full force. The Berlin airlift, the Korean War, nuclear standoff. Everything General George Smith Patton had predicted, but he wouldn't live to see it. December 14th, 1945. Critical condition. The doctors told Beatrice to prepare for the end. Old blood and guts was slipping away. His legendary constitution, the iron will that had carried him through decades of combat, was finally breaking down. But even now, even at the edge of death, George Smith Patton's mind was on war, on duty, on the missions left unfinished. "I should be fighting," he murmured, "not lying here. A hell of a way to die indeed." But what happened next would shock everyone who thought they knew the final chapter of Old Blood and Guts' story. December 21st, 1945, 12 days after the accident. General George Smith Patton lay unconscious. The pneumonia had overwhelmed his respiratory system. Blood clots had formed in his lungs. His heart was failing. The end was near. Outside the hospital room, the hallway was crowded. Officers from the Third Army, staff members who'd served under him, reporters waiting for the announcement. Everyone knew what was coming. Inside, Beatrice sat holding his hand. She'd barely left his side in 12 days. She'd watched her husband, the most dynamic, energetic, powerful man she'd ever known, reduced to this helpless state. But even now, even unconscious, George Smith Patton's face showed that familiar determination, that iron jaw, those hard features that had intimidated subordinates and terrified enemies. This was the man who told his Third Army in 1944, "We're not just going to shoot the bastards, we're going to cut out their living guts and use them to grease the treads of our tanks." This was Old Blood and Guts, the man who'd led the fastest advance in military history across France. The man who'd relieved Bastogne when everyone said it was impossible. The man who'd wanted to march to Moscow. And now his body was shutting down. At 5:50 in the afternoon, on December 21st, 1945, General George Smith Patton's heart stopped beating. He was 60 years old. The doctors emerged from the room. The announcement was made. The greatest combat general in United States military history was dead. Within hours, the news flashed around the world. Radio broadcasts interrupted regular programming. Newspapers prepared special editions. In the United States, the reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Flags were lowered to half-staff. Veterans wept. Former soldiers of the Third Army gathered in bars and VFW halls, toasting their fallen commander. "Old Blood and Guts is dead," they said to each other, and it didn't seem real. In Germany, even among the defeated enemy, there was a strange respect. German officers who'd fought against the Third Army acknowledged that they'd faced a master. One former Wehrmacht commander said, "We knew Patton was dangerous from the first day. He understood mobile warfare better than almost anyone. If Germany had to lose, at least we lost to a worthy opponent." But the most telling reactions came from those who'd served directly under General George Smith Patton. These were the men who'd seen him up close, who'd witnessed his leadership, who'd followed him into combat. General Hobart Gay, his chief of staff, said, "He was the greatest combat commander I ever served with. He understood one thing above all: attack, 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 never defend, never retreat, always forward." General John Wood, who'd commanded a division under Old Blood and Guts, said, "Patton could see 3 moves ahead like a chess master. While we were fighting today's battle, he was already planning next week's breakthrough." Another officer said, "He wasn't just our commander, he was our inspiration. When things looked darkest, when the enemy seemed strongest, George Smith Patton would appear at the front, profanity blazing, pearl-handled pistols gleaming, and suddenly we knew we'd win. The enlisted men, the tankers, the infantrymen, the artillery crews, they had their own stories. Tales of old blood and guts showing up during battles, standing in the open while shells exploded around him, seemingly immune to fear. Stories of his profane speeches before attacks, speeches that left them simultaneously terrified and inspired. Memories of seeing him after victories, his face covered in dust, his uniform dirty from being at the front, congratulating them personally. "He led from the front," one sergeant said. "That's why we called him Old Blood and Guts. He didn't ask us to do anything he wouldn't do himself." But there was another dimension to the morning, a sense of what might have been. Because General George Smith Patton had died with his final mission unfulfilled. He'd warned about the Soviets and nobody had listened. He'd seen the next war coming and he'd been silenced. On December 23, 1945, George Smith Patton was laid to rest at the American Military Cemetery in Ham, Luxembourg. He was buried among the soldiers of the Third Army who'd fallen during the Battle of the Bulge. This had been his request. "Let me lie with my men," he'd said months earlier. "If I die, bury me where they fell." Thousands attended the funeral: generals, politicians, reporters, and soldiers. The honor guard was composed of men from the Third Army, veterans who'd fought under Old Blood and Guts from Normandy to the Rhine. They stood at attention, tears streaming down their faces, as the coffin was lowered into the ground. The eulogy spoke of his courage, his tactical brilliance, his unwavering commitment to victory. But it didn't mention his warnings about the Soviets. It didn't mention his controversial statements. It didn't mention that he died frustrated, sidelined, convinced that his country was making a terrible mistake. That would come later. The vindication would come later. But on that cold December day in 1945, they simply mourned the loss of Old Blood and Guts. One soldier, standing at attention during the funeral, whispered to his companion, "He saved my life at Bastogne. We were surrounded, outnumbered, freezing." Then here came Patton's Third Army, smashing through the German lines like they were made of paper. That was Old Blood and Guts, always attacking, always advancing, always winning. Another soldier, tears in his eyes, said, "I saw him once, right after we crossed the Rhine. He was standing on the bridge, watching us cross, and he looked like he owned the damn river, like he'd personally conquered it. That's what he was, a conqueror, and now he's gone." The ceremony ended, the soldiers dispersed, the generals returned to their duties. Life moved on. But something had changed in the United States military. A chapter had closed. The age of Patton was over. Or was it? In the months and years following his death, General George Smith Patton's legacy only grew stronger. The man they'd called Old Blood and Guts became a legend, and his warnings about the Soviet Union proved prophetic. By 1948, the Soviets had consolidated control over Eastern Europe. The Iron Curtain, a term Winston Churchill coined in March of 1946, had descended across the continent. Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria, and East Germany were all under communist control. Exactly what George Smith Patton had predicted. The Berlin blockade in 1948 forced the United States into the Berlin airlift, nearly triggering a war with, now the Soviet Union. General Lucius Clay, who commanded United States forces in Germany, said, "We should have listened to Patton. He saw this coming 3 years ago. We could have prevented it then. Now we're stuck." In June of 1950, North Korea, backed by the Soviet Union and Communist China, invaded South Korea. The United States was forced into another war just 5 years after defeating Germany and Japan. 50,000 American soldiers would die in Korea. Many military historians believe that if the United States had confronted the Soviets in 1945, as George Smith Patton had advocated, the Korean War might never have happened. General Matthew Ridgway, who commanded United States forces in Korea, said in 1952, "Patton was right about the Soviets. We defeated Nazi Germany only to enable an even more dangerous enemy. History will record that old blood and guts saw the future more clearly than any of us." The vindication continued. By 1960, the Cold War was in full force. Nuclear weapons aimed at every major city. Proxy wars around the globe. Billions spent on defense. The constant threat of annihilation. Everything General George Smith Patton had foreseen. Former President Dwight Eisenhower, who'd been Patton's superior officer and who'd often clashed with him, admitted in his memoir, George Patton was perhaps the most brilliant combat commander in American history. He was also difficult, controversial, and politically tone-deaf, but his understanding of the Soviet threat was ahead of its time. I wish we'd taken his warnings more seriously. But George Smith Patton's legacy wasn't just political, it was military. The Third Army's campaigns across France and Germany in 1944 and 45 remained the gold standard for mobile warfare. Military academies around the world studied old blood and guts tactics. His emphasis on speed, aggression, and combined arms warfare influenced generations of military officers. The United States Army Armor School at Fort Knox, Kentucky, made General George Smith Patton their patron saint. His portrait hung in every classroom. His quotes were memorized by every student. His campaigns were dissected, analyzed, and emulated. "There are two kinds of generals," one instructor told his students in 1965. "Those who try to be like Patton, and those who know they never can be." In Vietnam, military officers tried to apply Patton's principles of mobile warfare to jungle combat. It didn't always work. Guerrilla warfare required different tactics. But the attempt showed how deeply old blood and guts had influenced military thinking. General Creighton Abrams, who'd served as a young officer under George Smith Patton, and who later commanded United States forces in Vietnam, said, "Everything I learned about leadership, I learned from Patton. He taught me that audacity wins battles, that speed and shock can overcome superior numbers, that a general's job is to lead from the front, not push from the rear." By the time of the 1970 film Patton, starring George C. Scott, old blood and guts had become an American icon. The film won 7 Academy Awards and introduced a new generation to General George Smith Patton's story. The opening scene, Patton standing before a giant American flag, delivering a profanity-laced speech to his troops, became one of the most famous moments in cinema history, but movies couldn't fully capture what George Smith Patton had been. The real man was more complex, more brilliant, and more controversial than any film could show. He'd been a poet who wrote about death and reincarnation, a scholar who'd studied military history obsessively, a mystic who believed he'd fought at Troy, at Carthage, with Napoleon, a modern general who understood tank warfare better than almost anyone alive. He'd been fearless to the point of recklessness, profane to the point of offense, ambitious to the point of arrogance. But he'd also been loyal to his soldiers, protective of his men, and absolutely committed to victory. "My men don't surrender," he'd once said. "I don't want to hear of any soldier under my command being captured unless he's been hit. Even if you're hit, you can still fight. Even if you can't fight, you can still shoot. Even if you can't shoot, you can still bite." This was old blood and guts. This was the general who'd terrified the Germans, frustrated his superiors, inspired his soldiers, and changed military history. And his death remained controversial. Some historians believe the car accident wasn't an accident at all. They point to his vocal opposition to Soviet expansion, his conflicts with political leaders, and the convenient timing of his death. Could George Smith Patton have been assassinated? The evidence is circumstantial, but the theories persist. What's not? Controversial is his impact. The United States military still studies General George Smith Patton's campaigns. NATO still uses his principles of mobile warfare. Military leaders still quote his speeches. 75 years after his death, old blood and guts remains relevant. So, why does General George Smith Patton's final statement, "This is a hell of a way to die," resonates so powerfully even today? Because it encapsulates everything he was: a warrior facing an unwanted peace, a combat general dying in a hospital bed, a man who'd lived by the sword, forced to die without it. The tragedy wasn't just that he died, the tragedy was how he died: helpless, paralyzed, unable to fight. Old Blood and Guts had once said, "The object of war is not to die for your country, but to make the other bastard die for his." He'd lived by that philosophy. He'd sent thousands of enemy soldiers to their deaths while keeping his own casualties remarkably low. His speed and aggression had saved American lives by ending battles quickly. But in the end, George Smith Patton couldn't save himself. Not from a car accident, not from a broken neck, not from the simple random bad luck that strikes without warning. "This is a hell of a way to die." Those words became his epitaph because they revealed his soul. He wasn't afraid of death. He was disappointed by it. This wasn't the ending he'd envisioned. He'd imagined dying in glory, leading a charge, taking enemy fire, going forward until the last moment. Instead, he died in a hospital bed, paralyzed, helpless, watching his body fail. But perhaps there's another way to understand his final words. Perhaps "this is a hell of a way to die" wasn't just about the manner of his death. Perhaps it was about the timing. He was dying just when he was needed most. The Soviet threat was growing. The Cold War was beginning. The United States needed strong military leadership, and Old Blood and Guts was being taken. Off the board, history proved General George Smith Patton right. The Soviets did become the enemy. The Cold War did consume 45 years and trillions of dollars. American soldiers did fight and die in Korea, Vietnam, and dozens of smaller conflicts, all because the United States failed to confront Soviet expansion when it had the chance. George Smith Patton saw it coming. He warned his superiors. He begged them to act. They ignored him. And 12 days after a car accident, he died, taking his warnings with him. But his legacy didn't die. The Third Army soldiers who'd fought under him carried his lessons forward. The officers he'd trained became the generals of the Cold War. The tactics he'd perfected became doctrine. Old Blood and Guts shaped the United States military for generations after his death. Today at the United States Military Academy at West Point, every cadet learns about General George Smith Patton. They study his campaigns. They analyze his decisions. They debate his controversies. But most importantly, they learn his fundamental lesson: audacity wins wars. Hesitation loses them. At Fort Benning, Georgia, the Patton Museum displays his personal effects. The pearl-handled pistols, the uniforms, the Jeep he rode in across Europe. Thousands of visitors come every year to see these artifacts, to connect with the legend of Old Blood and Guts. At the cemetery in Luxembourg, his grave remains one of the most visited military graves in Europe. Veterans make pilgrimages there. Active duty soldiers stop by to pay respects. Civilians who've never served come to honor the man who helped save the world from Nazi tyranny. The headstone is simple, just his name, rank, and dates. But standing before it, you can almost hear his voice, that commanding tone, that aggressive spirit, that absolute certainty in the rightness of his cause. This is a hell of a way to die. Yes, General, yes it was. You deserved better. You deserved to die leading your men forward, attacking the enemy, going down fighting. Instead, you died in a hospital bed, defeated by random chance. But your legacy lives forever. This is why they called him Old Blood and Guts. Not just because he was tough, not just because he was aggressive, but because he embodied the warrior spirit in its purest form. He lived for battle. He excelled at combat. He understood war at a level few humans ever reach. And when he couldn't fight anymore, when his body betrayed him, when death came not as an enemy to defeat, but as an inevitability to accept, even then, George Smith Patton remained true to himself. Even then, he wished he was fighting. Even then, he was a warrior. The legend of Old Blood and Guts lives on in every tank commander who charges forward instead of waiting, in every general who leads from the front instead of commanding from the rear, in every soldier who refuses to surrender, refuses to quit, refuses to accept defeat. George Smith Patton died on December 21st, 1945, but his spirit, that aggressive, unstoppable, victorious spirit, that will never die. This is why the United States military still studies him. This is why historians still debate him. This is why his name still carries weight 75 years after his death. Because Old Blood and Guts showed us what a warrior looks like. And warriors never truly die. They live on in the battles their successors fight, in the victories their students win, in the legends that inspire new generations. "This is a hell of a way to die," George Smith Patton said. "But General, you didn't die. You just transferred to a different kind of immortality, the immortality of legend, the immortality of history, the immortality of inspiration." And that's why they called him Old Blood and Guts. If this story of Old Blood and Guts' final days moved you, hit subscribe. We're bringing you more untold moments from General George Smith Patton, history's greatest combat commander. Because warriors like him deserve to be remembered. Their sacrifices deserve to be honored. Their lessons deserve to be learned. Next time, the Battle of Bastogne, how George Smith Patton did the impossible in 72 hours and saved 10,000 American lives. Don't miss it.